Hello, and welcome to the Mathematician's Podcast, the podcast where we follow the fascinating stories behind the figures that count in the history of mathematics. I'm Benjamin Cornish, and today we come to my home country for the first time as we explore Bede. He was a historian, an OG monk, a saint, and arguably, very arguably, a mathematician. I used to have a friend who was a consultant. I often asked him what he consulted in, or for, or indeed to, and he would usually shrug it off with some LinkedIn jargon about how he fixes forward-reaching opportunity divergences, or re-levels engagement and motivational disparities. I never really understood what he did, or what service he provided to. Well, I didn't even understand who it was that actually paid his invoices. One day he was working at a museum. I won't name them because I am still hoping that Bletchley Park will choose to sponsor this episode. So he was working at this anonymous museum and he was desperately trying to find the staff bathroom. Having tried all the doors that seemed appropriate, he came across one that had a combination lock on it. So naturally he tried 0000XC and it opened for him. Who would have guessed that this particular anonymous museum would have a tough time with code breaking? But this was not what he expected when he opened the door. Keen though he was to find porcelain, he found a staircase leading up to an attic space not otherwise accessible to guests or the public. In this room he found a treasure trove of old books, unpublished handwritten notebooks by what would appear to be a group of maybe 30 to 40 different people based on this style of handwriting. The style of the binding ranged from fairly modern and intact right back through to leather-bound yellow paper, and even one that could possibly have been parchment. He had been employed by the museum to backward compatibilize their target-facing aspirations and re-synergize pre-pandemic protocols, but with this discovery of first-hand accounts, he was sure he could revolutionize the forward indicators to be metric-centered and diversely uniform. The trouble was, there was just so many of them. Countless books. Each one required someone to have sat down and written, probably for hours, likely for no pay, and apparently in this cramped attic room, with only the ghosts of whoever came before. It was apparent, by the one bed in the corner, that someone lived alone in this room, for probably their whole adult life, documenting something. But the strange thing was, he couldn't even figure out what the books were actually about. Some arcane record-keeping written in a language that no one left alive could understand. Of the hundreds of written records, there was perhaps one book that still had useful and interesting meaning to a modern-day reader. Luckily, it was a maths book, and as a result of my friend's excellent consultancy, this unnamed museum now has an excellent provision detailing the maths of its own history. But it goes to show, not everything we find interesting should be written down, and even less of what gets written down is interesting in a few years' time. Luckily for me, I don't write anything down at all, and speak purely unscripted, new line, heading, start, new line. We shall start today in a way that Bede would have appreciated himself, with a brief and highly inaccurate history of the British Isles. You might notice there that I did not say a history of Britain, or should it be Great Britain? Honestly, even as a resident, I'm not sure if the moniker Great is official, or just what we like to call it. I also did not say England. It's one of those funny things that happens to me each time I fill out a form for a job application or insurance or such like. The first question will be, describe your identity, and it might list English, Welsh, Scottish, Irish or British. And then you have to decide whether you wish to identify more as an individual country or as a collective. I usually say British because English nationalism has a bad name at the moment. But then it might ask for ethnicity as white English, white Scottish, white other, white non-British, etc, which always makes me feel like a fool for not just writing English in the first box. So Bede was, well, he lived in the Kingdom of Northumbria, because England didn't exist at the time. So the Kingdom of Northumbria is currently in modern day, well, Northumbria. Northumbria didn't go anywhere, it's still called Northumbria, and I'm sure many of the residents of Northumbria get grumpy that the national identity form does not include Northumbrian. Northumbria is located in the country of England at the moment, which is not a member of the UN, as it's not considered a proper country. Instead, the country of England, I'm going to say stole the country of Wales, which is also not a separate sovereign state, and only gained nominal independence from English rule in the 80s. And so England and Wales are effectively one country, culturally two countries, and then they teamed up with Scotland, who was at the time a sovereign nation in 1707, and together they formed the new sovereign nation of Great Britain, which is the majority of the landmass of the British Isles. Ireland being the other large landmass in the British Isles, and this was a colony of Great Britain until most of it revolted and formed its own sovereign state, the Republic of Ireland, leaving just the north, which again is its own country, separate for now to the Republic of Ireland. But then Northern Ireland and Great Britain together form, and here is the proper title, the Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. 4 countries, arguably 3, lots of animosity, one sovereign state, and also that does not include Jersey or Guernsey or the Isle of Man, which are also in the British Isles and have an even more confusing history. So that's the modern situation, but we're meant to be doing history. So Bede is from Northumbria. Now I'm going to present my own bias. I come from the far superior kingdom of Wessex, and bias is important here because Bede, as a historian, tells us a great deal of the comings and goings of Northumbria itself, but gets a little hazy, or perhaps lazy, with anything down south, in particular Mercia, with whom he had much animosity. But I promised you an inaccurate history, so perhaps I can tell you the summarised version from Bede's own history book, an ecclesiastical history of the English people. History started in 55 AD when Caesar invaded with the Roman, that is the proper Roman legions. They did a great job and brought Christianity with them. After about 400 years, they had other jobs to do back on the continent, so the army left. This left a mixture of Roman Britons. Bede tells us nothing about who the pre-Roman Britons were, because they were heathens, and so I shall also not tell you. Bede then skips about 500 years, probably because King Arthur doesn't like his kingdom written about, and during this time there was a migration of Jutes, Angles and Saxons, hence the name Anglo-Saxon. The Jutes left the band before they got famous. The Anglo-Saxon tribes pushed the Roman Britons to the far west of the British Isles, where they magically turned into the Welsh, the Cornish and the Scottish. I should give an honourable mention here to the Picts, who were never conquered by the Romans and would at some point merge with the Gaelic Scots pushed out by the Anglo-Saxons. And also another honourable mention to the people of Hibernia, or Ireland if you prefer, with a group that were confusingly called the Scoti, also never conquered by the Romans. So Bede then picks the story up in about 600 AD when St Augustine converts the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Notice that the Gaelic tribes had their own version of Christianity all this time, but didn't want to share it. As I say, the religions that survive are the ones that feel it necessary to convert others. I will spare you the rest of history, save for a quote from the Wikipedia, which is the closest thing I have seen to opinionated commentary on Wikipedia, and I thought I would share it because it made me giggle. The climax of the third book is the account of the Council of Whitby, traditionally seen as a major turning point in English history. Wow, if that's the climax of his book, then I'm glad I didn't read the whole thing. So, there you have it, a brief history of the people of the British Isles. But Bede was born in 735 AD, which makes him a very late entry into this first chapter of my series. I said I was going to explore the Hellenistic tradition up to the Islamic Golden Age, which I am starting for convenience in 800 AD. The convenience here is that 800 AD is also the coronation of Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and the future emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. This is one of the descendants of Rome proper. So Bede has just about snuck under the wire of classical thinkers of antiquity before the universities start popping up. It has been about 200 years since our last mathematician, Eutychius, and Bede is by no means the next great philosopher. We have skipped over innumerable contributors to the classical canon, including Isidore of Seville and St Augustine. The thing that connects most of these people is that they are not really mathematicians, more concerned by Christian doctrine. How dull. So Bede was on my list of approximately 1,500 mathematicians leading up to the 1950s, and he's entry 147 to give you a clue as to how many got missed off the list. So too is Isidore of Seville, but I can't figure out why the original author included Isidore on a list of mathematicians. Bede has one mathematical footnote to his name, so let's get into that. One book called On the Reckoning of Time, just one out of the 60 plus books that he wrote in total. In the work On Time, we see a brief history of the measure of time from classical sources. First, Bede describes what the fundamental units of time are, these being hours, days, months, and years. The idea of a minute or a second were not really essential units in an era before clockwork. I should also add that every day had 12 hours of daylight, from sunup to sundown, which means that these hours were of unequal length. What I cannot say is how far north this system perpetrated, although I doubt that the Sampi people of Norway use this classical system, given that they often have daylight running for 24 hours. But hey, if you're listening, get in touch. I'd love to learn more. So those are the hours. The days are an obvious one, although it is interesting to note that when a new day begins. For Bede, this was following the Benedictine dictate, akin to the Jewish tradition, of the new day beginning at sunset. Although in On the Reckoning of Time, he discusses the scholarly definition of a day, midnight to midnight. The months then follow the phases of the moon, and the year is the period between the longest days. Although, how do you measure which days are the longest when each day is exactly 12 hours? So instead, we measure the days with the shortest shadows of a fixed gnomon, or vertical stick. Or to be more precise, the new year actually begins at the winter solstice, which is the shortest day, and that is traditionally celebrated on the 25th of December, following the Julian calendar. And yes, that's not the current date of the winter solstice, which, when converted into Gregorian, would have been about the 7th of January. Instead, our winter solstice is now around the 20th to the 23rd of December. But as it happens, over the course of 2,000 years, it can move about a fair bit. I would suggest asking a maths historian, that is, a different one. So Bede notes that the pre-Christians start the new year on the 25th of December. He astutely points out the convenience of this date now being the celebration of the birth of Christ, effectively sanctifying a traditional turning point of the year. And I think we are all encouraged to continue believing that Jesus was born on precisely that date, 0 AD. But Bede is a strong proponent of the civil New Year, starting on January 1st. He also notes that, economically, it may be beneficial to start the year on the 1st of September, which is when the Roman tax cycle begins. Hey, would you look at that? It's also the first day of school. I wonder if there's a link. So, as I was saying, in On Time, Bede breaks down the units of time and discusses the nuances of pre-existing calendars. He also gives an explanation for the differences we see in the lengths of the day based on the curvature of the Earth. He even argues for the effects of the moon and the sun on the tides. Now, we have seen this argument appear first with Aristarchus of Samos, although Bede goes further to identify that the times of the high tide can be different over different stretches of the same coast, something that would be harder to do from the island of Samos, and uses this to make an argument that when it is high tide in one place, it must be low tide in another. This, to me, is a hint of an argument around the incompressibility of fluid. Maybe. Bede then goes on to discuss Easter, and in fact this is the central focus of the work. Bede provides detailed instructions for calculating the date of the Paschal full moon, so this is the Passover moon used to celebrate Passover in the Jewish tradition, and it is the first full moon after the spring equinox, which is the midpoint between the summer and the winter solstice. And subsequently, the Paschal moon and Easter Sunday is based on a 19-year lunar cycle. He explains the use of tools like a Paschal tables to make these complex calculations manageable for clerics and monks. And this is the reason that Easter is always on a different day each year, and this is why I can never keep track of the bank holidays. He is also very helpful and very humorously calculated the age of the universe, dating the Garden of Eden to precisely 3952 BC, which he did by calculating the ages of the genealogy of key figures mentioned in the Bible, from Adam and Eve right through to the Israelite kings, and from there you get into actual history, and one can get more confident with the span up to Jesus. Now, this sounds like a fun task, but he took it seriously, as did his colleagues. In fact, some colleagues took it so seriously that they petitioned to have him excommunicated, as it contrasted with the well-established value of 5200 BC, courtesy of friend of the podcast, Isidore of Seville. It is not, however, just a controversy to have a slightly different number. The issue is that Isidore used a Greek translation of the Old Testament, called the Greek Septuagint, which was a 400 BC translation of Hebrew texts, but Bede used the 500 AD translation of the Latin Vulgate, commissioned by the Pope and written by St. Jerome. St. Jerome was trying to fix the issue of too many bad Latin translations, so he went to the Greek copy, but then realised he needed to go back to the Hebrew. But by then, 700 years later, the official Hebrew version had been changed, and so we see a mismatch. Some books of the Old Testament were not included, books like Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, and 1 and 2 Maccabees. Yes, this is a lot of conversation about biblical translation for a maths podcast, but I just want to give you all the more reasons to trust in organised religion. Speaking of dating a mathematician, you might have noticed that throughout the podcast series, I have tried hard to use the more inclusive language of BCE and CE, that is, before the Common Era and the Common Era. And therefore, it might grate at you to hear me using BC and AD, which are the terms before Christ and Anno Domini, or in the year of our Lord. My podcast platform tells me that I have had listeners from over 120 countries, many of which would not recognise such a focus as Christ as the starting point of time. The reason then I have made the change for this episode is to recognise Bede as a big proponent of the AD-BC system. Whilst it is a little Christian-centric for modern taste, it is a great deal better than what preceded it. The most common standard dating system for the years prior was to refer to the number of years since a particular monarch was crowned, the regnal years, or perhaps the founding of a particular city. This got difficult in Rome in the year of 4 emperors. It also made international treaties harder when different monarchs had ruled for different periods, and so multiple dates were needed to start the document. Bede did not invent the AD-BC system, but given how influential he was as a writer and how much work he did on calendars and dating generally, it is with significant thanks to Bede that we used it for so long in the West. That is, before all the woke podcasters started saying BCE. And much like the content of his book, it is about time that we wrap up. As I said, Bede didn't give us much maths, but he did give some epic, or rather epochal, work on counting and calendars. And he gives us an interesting opportunity to talk about how time and dates really worked in ancient days. Next week, we will be looking at the very last mathematician on my list before that big milestone of 800 CE, or is it 800 AD, the start of the Islamic Golden Age and the crowning of Charlemagne. After next week, then, we will go back to the start of recorded history in a little town in India. But there is one last stop in the Hellenistic world, although curiously still in the English part of the Hellenistic world, and in fact just down the road from Bede in York. So I'll see you later with Alcyon of York. But if you can't wait until next week, please do come and say hi to me on Blue Sky at mathematicians-pod, or I've become pretty active on Reddit at mathematicians-pod, or perhaps more excitingly on YouTube at unnatural numbers, that's un-natural numbers. Last night I met up with another lovely bunch of mathematicians to talk about the number 7. So that should be airing on YouTube any day now. Go check it out, it was really fun. I will tell you all about why a heptagon cannot be constructed. Until then, goodbye. The music today is Danse Macabre Finale by Kevin MacLeod. You can find more information in the show notes.